Every great power treats its currency like a law of nature, unbreakable, permanent. Each generation is certain it's smarter than the last, immune to the mistakes of history, and then reality hits. Suddenly, the numbers people spent their lives trusting no longer mean anything, and the system they depended on collapses without warning. From ancient Rome to revolutionary France, from the American Civil War to modern financial crises, the story repeats with eerie consistency. Money fails, systems crack, and the people who suffer the most are almost always the ones who believe the illusion of permanence. Because that's the lie at the center of every collapse. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and we assume they're solid, immutable, permanent. But money isn't concrete or steel. Money is trust. And trust can disappear faster than anything else humans have ever invented. That's why history is so unforgiving and so valuable. Every financial collapse leaves behind clues, patterns, warnings. And if you pay attention to who survives and who doesn't, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The survivors aren't the people who trusted the system the most. They're the ones who questioned it first. Take the Byzantine Empire, for example. Often remembered as the eastern continuation of Rome, Byzantium somehow survived for nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell apart. At the center of its economic power was a single coin, the gold solidus. For centuries, it was trusted across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Merchants accepted it without hesitation. In many ways, it was the medieval world's closest thing to a global reserve currency. And you'd think the Byzantines would have learned from Rome's earlier mistake with the silver denarius. Rome had slowly debased its silver coins until they were little more than cheap metal coated with a thin layer of silver. That decision destroyed confidence and helped unravel the empire's economy. But history doesn't just repeat, it echoes. Centuries later, Byzantium made the same mistake, this time with gold. Emperors began shaving purity off the solidus, mixing in cheaper metals, stretching the coin further than it was ever meant to go. At first, no one noticed. Trade continued. Confidence held. But eventually, the cracks showed. Trust weakened. And once that trust broke, the solidus was exposed for what it had become. A political promise pretending to be money. The result was devastating. The coin that once anchored Mediterranean trade lost credibility, and with it, the economic stability of the empire itself. What survived wasn't imperial authority or official decrees. It was real gold quietly hoarded outside government control. It was land held beyond the reach of debasement. Those assets endured. Everything else dissolved. That brings us to the first timeless lesson of financial collapse. Governments cannot resist the temptation to dilute money, and when they do, real value escapes into forms they cannot manufacture. But not every collapse starts with rulers manipulating coins. Sometimes catastrophe arrives without warning. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half the population died. Entire towns vanished. Trade routes collapsed. Civilization itself seemed to stagger under the weight of unimaginable loss. And yet, the economic consequences weren't as simple as total destruction. When half the labor force disappears, labor becomes precious. Survivors suddenly had leverage their ancestors never imagined. Wages rose, land became abundant relative to people, homes stood empty, fields went unplowed. Families with liquidity, silver, goods, or even just the ability to work found themselves in a buyer's market. Land that once cost a fortune could now be purchased for a fraction of its former value. Social hierarchies shifted. Peasants became landowners. Survivors climbed economic ladders that had been locked for generations. If that sounds familiar, it should. During the COVID pandemic, the same pattern emerged in modern form. Supply chains fractured. Governments printed trillions to keep economies from seizing up. And while markets rebounded, inequality exploded. Those with liquidity bought assets, homes, stocks, businesses, while millions of people living paycheck to paycheck fell further behind. Housing prices surged. Stock markets recovered almost instantly. Meanwhile, ordinary families struggled to cover rent. The rhyme with history couldn't be clearer. Pandemics don't just destroy wealth, they redistribute it. The uncomfortable truth is this: crises reward those with reserves and punish those without them. And while pandemics show how quickly external shocks can flip an economy, the collapse of Renaissance Florence reveals something just as important, that institutions which appear invincible can fall without mercy. In the 14th century, Florence was Europe's financial powerhouse. It was home to legendary banking families whose influence stretched across kingdoms. These banks lent massive sums to monarchs, including England's King Edward III, who needed money to fund his wars with France. When Edward defaulted on his debts, the illusion shattered instantly. Florence's major banks collapsed, depositors were wiped out. trade froze. A city built on financial confidence descended into chaos. Ordinary citizens learned a painful lesson. Size is not safety. Reputation is not protection. Institutions exist to profit, not to guarantee your survival. And when they fail, they take your savings with them. That lesson has resurfaced in every era since. From Florence to the 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers, from supposedly stable banks to entire financial systems freezing overnight, too big to fail isn't a modern phrase. It's an ancient fantasy. And nowhere is that clearer than in the financial battlefield of the American Civil War. Most people remember the war for its battles and political consequences, but beneath the gunfire was a monetary experiment that reshaped American finance forever. Both the Union and the Confederacy discovered that wars on this scale require massive spending, and that meant printing money. In the North, the U.S. government introduced greenbacks, paper currency not backed by gold, but by faith in the government itself. At first, it worked. But as more greenbacks flooded the economy, inflation eroded their value. Prices rose, confidence wavered. In the South, the situation was far worse. The Confederacy printed enormous quantities of paper money, known as graybacks, in a desperate attempt to survive. By the end of the war, inflation reached catastrophic levels. Prices exploded, salaries became meaningless, soldiers were paid with money that lost value before they could even spend it. Families carried bags of cash that could barely buy bread. By 1865, Confederate currency wasn't weak, it was dead. And once again, the pattern was unmistakable. Paper promises collapsed. Real assets endured. What mattered in the collapse of the Confederacy wasn't loyalty to a flag or faith in printed bills. What mattered was what couldn't be inflated away. Land still fed families. Food still kept people alive. Gold still held value. Anything real survived while paper money became a cruel joke. For ordinary Southerners, this was catastrophic. Lifetimes of savings vanished in months. But for those who held tangible goods, the chaos became opportunity. Property changed hands at fire sale prices. Wealth didn't disappear. It moved. It's an uncomfortable chapter of American history and one that's rarely discussed. But it delivers a lesson that still applies today. Even your own country is not immune to currency collapse. And when it happens, protection doesn't come from what's printed on paper. It comes from what exists outside the system's ability to manipulate. France learned that lesson the hard way during its revolution. In the 1790s, after overthrowing the monarchy and seizing church lands, the revolutionary government introduced a new paper currency called the assignat. On paper, it sounded reasonable. These notes were supposedly backed by real property. They were meant to stabilize the economy and fund a new republic built on equality and progress. But reality quickly intervened. The government printed assignats aggressively. Each new batch diluted the value of the last. Prices surged, wages lagged, trust evaporated. Farmers refused to sell food for paper money, demanding silver or goods instead. In Paris, bread riots returned. The revolution that promised liberation began devouring its own people. Once again, the winners weren't the ones holding patriotic currency. They were the ones holding food, gold, land, things the government couldn't create with a printing press. For everyday Parisians, the realization came too late. When trust broke, savings didn't slowly erode. They vanished. Fast forward 2 centuries, and the same lesson reappears on the other side of the world. In 1997, a speculative attack on Thailand's currency triggered what became known as the Asian financial crisis. Thailand had borrowed heavily in US dollars, confident its currency peg would hold. But when that peg collapsed, everything unraveled at once. Debts denominated in foreign currency doubled overnight. Investors fled, panic spread, currencies across Southeast Asia fell in rapid succession. Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, entire economies were dragged into the storm. Businesses failed, unemployment surged. Governments turned to the International Monetary Fund for rescue, but the pain wasn't shared equally. The hedge funds and global investors who triggered the collapse largely escaped with profits or minimal losses. The real damage fell on ordinary citizens. Savings lost value, mortgages became unpayable, jobs disappeared. What looked like a local crisis was, in truth, a massive transfer of wealth. And once again, the pattern held. Those who held dollars or assets abroad survived better than those who trusted local currency. Countries burdened with debt in someone else's money were forced into austerity. Meanwhile, foreign institutions bought up distressed assets at bargain prices. The lesson couldn't be clearer. Debt in a currency you don't control is a trap. When the storm hits, it's not the creditor who drowns. It's the debtor. By now, the picture should be coming into focus. Whether it's Byzantium, Revolutionary France, Civil War America, or modern Asia, the same themes repeat. Paper money collapses. Debt tightens its grip. And the people who survive are never the ones who trust the system most deeply, but the ones who recognize its fragility before it cracks. And here's the part that should make this feel uncomfortably real. Collapse isn't ancient history. It isn't confined to dusty textbooks or distant continents. It's happening right now. Between 2019 and 2021, Lebanon experienced a financial implosion that few in the developed world thought possible. Banks closed their doors, deposits were frozen, withdrawals were restricted. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value. People woke up to discover that their life savings were effectively gone. Doctors, engineers, retirees, middle-class families who had done everything right. They trusted the banks, they trusted the system, and they were wiped out. People lined up outside bank branches begging for access to their own money, only to be told it was unavailable, or simply gone. The realization hit hard and fast. Money in the bank is not a vault. It's a loan you've made to an institution that can decide, in a crisis, not to pay you back. Those who survived best were the ones who diversified abroad, held real assets like gold or property, or kept wealth outside the banking system. Everyone else was trapped. And if this feels distant, it shouldn't. In 2008, Americans watched their homes foreclosed and their pensions evaporate while the banks responsible were rescued. In 2020, trillions were created overnight, inflating asset prices and widening the gap between those who owned assets and those who didn't. In 2023, regional banks in the United States collapsed almost overnight when confidence cracked, reminding everyone that too big to fail is a story we tell ourselves, until the doors close. So the real question isn't whether financial systems fail. History makes that answer painfully clear. The real question is, what survives when they do? And the answer, frustratingly, is never simple. In Byzantium, it was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity and the ability to buy abandoned land. In Florence, survival meant not trusting powerful bankers. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods. In revolutionary France, it was food and property. In Asia, it was avoiding foreign currency debt. In Lebanon, it was getting out of the banks before it was too late. The pattern changes. The principle doesn't. Survival doesn't come from blind faith in institutions or paper promises. It comes from understanding what holds value when illusions collapse. And here's the paradox that history keeps throwing in our faces. Collapse is both a tragedy and an opportunity. For the unprepared, it's ruin. But for those with resilience, liquidity, or assets that can't be printed into oblivion, it's a moment of transformation. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners. After 2008, those with cash bought homes while millions were forced out. Every crisis creates a transfer, from those who trusted to those who prepared. But wealth isn't just about what you own, it's also about what you can do. The people who rose during collapses weren't only the ones holding gold or land, they were the ones who could still create value when money lost meaning. Bakers who could feed communities, craftsmen who could repair what others couldn't replace, farmers who could produce food, merchants who could move goods across broken systems. In every crisis, currency becomes unreliable, but production never does. People still need to eat, build, trade, and survive. And those who can meet those needs are never poor for long. That's the deeper form of protection. Not faith in governments, not hope that institutions will save you, but real assets, real skills, and the awareness that illusions always collapse. Every financial crisis is a transfer. From paper to reality, from promises to production, from passive savers to active builders. History has shown us this pattern again and again, so the question isn't whether everything falls apart. It always does. The question is whether you'll be one of the many left holding promises, or one of the few holding something real. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this changed the way you see money, power, and survival, hit subscribe. History already has the answers. I'll show you where to find them.